Now, before we explore the other ways of building Angular apps, which can help us get rid of the disadvantages I mentioned before, I first of all want to show you how you could deploy this application here, how you could deploy this single page application. And as mentioned before, you just need a static web host for that. So if you search for static web host, you'll find plenty of hosting providers that offer you just that, static web hosting. Now, one provider which I like quite a bit for hosting static web apps is Firebase, which is a service offered by Google. But you can, of course, use any service you want. The great thing about Firebase is that you can get started with hosting for free though. All you need to do is log in with your Google account and then go to the Firebase console. There, you then want to create a new project and give it any name of your choice, like ng deployment example, but the name is up to you, of course. You then must accept the terms and check this box. And on the next page, we can actually disable Google Analytics here. We don't need that for this demo. And that will then get Firebase started with the project setup. Now, Firebase is a service that offers much more than just hosting. You could also use a database offered by Firebase to connect it to your web application if you were building a more complex application. So you can definitely also explore those other offerings. Here, I only care about the hosting though. So with that project created, we can go to this build area here on the left and choose hosting. And there you'll then find all the steps you need to go through to host an application with Firebase, a static application, a static website, as it says here. So I'll click on Get Started. And then as a first step, we must install this tool here on our system, this Firebase CLI. So in my terminal, I'll run this command, and on macOS and Linux, you might need to add sudo in front of this to make it work. So this will now install the Firebase CLI on our system, which we will need in order to use Firebase in this project and to connect this application to a Firebase project. So with that finished, we can move on to the next step, and then run this command here to log in with that Firebase CLI. So that's what I'll do, run Firebase login. And once you did that, you're ready for the next step, which is to initialize your local project as a Firebase project, which simply means that some configuration files will be added and a link to the Firebase project will be set up. So if you run Firebase init here, you'll be asked a couple of questions. For example, which Firebase features you want to use. And as mentioned, there are many features you could use, but here I only need the hosting feature. So I'll navigate to hosting and use space to activate this, and then hit enter. Next, I'll choose use an existing project because I already created a project on Firebase, which I want to use. So this now refers to Firebase projects, not Angular projects. And I'll then select that one project which I did create before. Now, regarding the build directory, you should not use the default, which would be public, but instead point at that browser folder in the dist routing folder, in my case, because it's that folder that contains the files that should be deployed. So my public directory here is dist/routing/browser. And with that, I'll hit enter and then choose Y for this question, whether I want to configure it as a single page app. Y for yes, because that is what I want to do here. I only have one single HTML file. And this is an important setting because otherwise routing might not work once the app is deployed. Because if a user then sends a request to some domain/tasks and Firebase doesn't know what to do with that request, since the browser folder contains no tasks subfolder, the request might fail without that setting. So this setting is important so that Firebase makes sure that all requests, no matter which path they have, reach this one single HTML file and therefore the script code loaded by that file, which then does allow the Angular router to take over and handle that incoming request. So that's an important setting that must be set to yes here. Now here I don't care about automatic builds and deploys, so I'll choose N for no, and with that finally the initialization is done. Now with that, some new files have been added. Essentially these two Firebase files, which contain the configuration details that we just set up. And with that done, now finally we're ready to deploy the application by running Firebase deploy. So now here in my terminal, I'll run that command, and that will now go ahead and deploy my build files to Firebase. For that to work, you of course, first of all, need to run npm run build though. Now, we already did that here, but you must run the build command first so that you have this dist folder, which is being deployed. That's important. By the way, you should make sure that you don't have some white space here, as I did initially, because otherwise it will actually create a new folder that doesn't contain your application code. So that public folder path here really must be the correct path to that browser folder without any leading white space or anything like that. Now with that, the project will be deployed, and as a result, you should actually already get a link here that allows you to visit the deployed website. So Firebase also automatically sets up some dummy domain for you, which you can use to preview the deployed website. You can of course also link your own domain if you want to. Here I'll visit this domain though, and there indeed I can see that this all seems to work. My users are there, the issues are there, and the application works the way it should. Now in your Firebase project, you could configure the details of this deployment. As mentioned, you could, for example, add a custom domain if you wanted to, but here for this demo, I will not do that. Instead, I will now move on to these other build options I mentioned before, because building a single page application, as we did it here, is just one thing you can do with your Angular app. So in the previous lecture, you learned how you can deploy an Angular application as a single page application to Firebase. And of course, Firebase hosting was just one example. Of course, you can deploy Angular applications to any host, as mentioned in the last lecture. Now, it's also worth noting that in that last lecture, I showed you the manual deployment approach, which is good to know, but it turns out that you can actually also use the Angular CLI for deployment. Because the Angular CLI gives you a command, the ng-add command, which you can use to add third-party libraries that support this command to Angular. And this command will then not just install those libraries, you could do that with npm install, but it will also configure them for your Angular project, or configure your project for those libraries, depending on how you want to look at it. And there, for example, is an @angular/fire library, which you can add with that ng-add command, which will in the end add Firebase to your project, so which will enable Firebase hosting in your project. And the CLI will then also give you an ng-deploy command, which will in the end build the application for you and then deploy the project to that configured deployment provider, so to Firebase, for example. And that would have been an alternative. And I'm also mentioning this here because there also are other deployment providers like Netlify, which are supported by the Angular CLI. And therefore, visiting this documentation page, which you also find attached to this lecture, can be a good idea when it comes to deploying Angular applications.